It's a ridiculous scenario if people are turning children away that need their help and their provision, and they use Ofsted as the excuse for turning them away. This is a real problem. We are a very high-performing country unless you're disadvantaged, unless you've got special educational needs. The work to put children first gets done by staff. We need great teachers in schools. And again, as naive as this sounds, I don't want Ofsted to be the barrier for people in the profession, and we've heard far too many times about people saying the stress of an Ofsted inspection and that's the reason that they left. Consistency matters. So what you want on inspection for consistency, you want an inspector leading. Consistency comes through constancy, so constantly leading inspection. The overall effectiveness grade was far too simple. We wanted something which spoke to the nuance and complexity. Was it too complicated? That's the feedback that we were hearing. It was too hard. I still know there's an element of stress. I can't remove all stress from an inspection. I just can't. The methodology, the humane approach, a Teams call rather than a phone call, see the inspector, share a screen, all of those things are to try to make it a more human process.
Welcome to this special bonus episode of Trust Matters Lessons in Leadership, the podcast where we explore the ideas, people, and decisions shaping the future of our schools and trusts. Today, we're joined by someone right at the centre of one of the biggest shifts in education in a generation, Sir Martyn Oliver, His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Ofsted. As the new inspection framework rolls out, Sir Martyn and Ofsted have spent the last year in conversation with the sector to build, in his words, the most human version of Ofsted yet. In this conversation, we go beyond headlines and toolkits. We talk about how his years leading schools shaped his approach to the new framework, what the pilots taught Ofsted about what works and what doesn't, and what it would take for inspection to feel more supportive. This is a really rare opportunity to step inside the thinking of the person leading one of the most significant changes to education in the last 30 years, and to explore not just the framework, but the human intent behind it. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. Well, firstly, welcome to the podcast, Sir Martyn. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Just Martyn. But
Just
thank
Martyn.
you. Just
Well,
Martyn.
keep that in mind.
I always think it's a good idea that I'm not called William, or has it been just William?
Yeah. We'll drop the Sir for now, although it's there. But before we get into Ofsted and the new framework, I'd love to start a bit further back.
Okay.
Could you tell us a little bit about your own school days and why you wanted to become a teacher?
Oh, wow. That's a long way back then. Okay. Well, yeah, it's certainly... I had a very mixed schooling. I was actually ill as a child. I had childhood convulsions when I was 2, and they were really very severe. And I took really heavy medication, which is the same medication they still use today, but it really knocks you out. It calms you down. My mind works quickly, and it still does. And I think it's a bit more technical than that, but it just basically meant that I would have it as an early child. I had convulsions. So I didn't miss school through illness, but I did miss some schooling because of that. And of course, the medication quietened my mind. So schooling was really rather interesting to me. And it's only in my mid-teens that I came off this medication because it's so powerful. You have to come off it very, very, very slowly over a very long period of time. And of course, a lot of the things that you need to remember in education, I was struggling to because my mind was quietened. And essentially, it meant that I got into secondary school, and that by that point, it was quite a struggle for me. And I had some brilliant teachers that stand out. My English teacher, I love English. He was just an inspiration. Unfortunately for me, he got seconded. He did an exchange with an American English teacher, and he went to teach in America, and the American teacher came to teach in England. And he was also brilliant, but he wasn't the same person. And that connection lost. And so there was something in that. And the other one that stood out was an art teacher. Some of the other teachers, not so much. Not so much. But of course, and I studied English, and I then went on to study art, and I became an art teacher. And it was very much down to those two teachers that I developed a love of literature and language, and also a love of art. And I took those through into the rest of my career.
And you went on to lead schools in quite challenging circumstances. Yeah. How did that shape who you became as a leader and what kind of chief inspector you want to be now?
Interestingly, in my first job, I remember looking at the wage slip, which is in a brown envelope back then. I taught in Lincolnshire, and it said Lincolnshire County Council. And it's quite strange because I just hadn't considered it the first time I opened a pay packet to see Lincolnshire County Council on it. And I was thinking to myself, that's interesting. I'm not paid for by the school. I'm paid for by the local authority, by the area in which I work. And I remember profoundly thinking to myself, well, does that mean that the state employs me, or I'm employed by this individual school? Now, of course, you're employed by the school, but it meant that sense of public service meant something. And I held on to that. And I came to realise that I worked my favourite job was when I became the head of sixth form, and I became an assistant head of sixth form first across 3 schools. It was a joint sixth form. And that gave me the sense of, it doesn't matter if I'm paid to work in this school, because I can also work in this school and this school. And that was back now in the early 90s, mid-90s. And so that really drove a lot of my thinking, and that was a challenging school. And then I moved up into County Durham and I worked in another challenging school, and I met the most inspirational head teacher. The best decision I made was actually I went to go and work in this school because of this head teacher. He had a reputation. Now, back then, this is before multi-academy trusts, because I went on to join one of the first multi-academy trusts late in the next phase of my career. But back then, you became a deputy head. You might become a head teacher, you might be head of a small school, you might become the head of a big school, and the pinnacle of your career might be that you chair your local secondary head or primary head association. But this head teacher, he just took deputy head after deputy head after deputy head, and he turned them into heads. And that was just really unusual. And I don't mean once, twice, 3, 4, 5. He was doing it just brilliantly. So there was something about him. And he was a real inspiration to me. And so I worked in this challenging school with this brilliant man. Now, weirdly, I became the deputy head there. Years before, never crossed our path, one of the people that he had turned from a deputy head into a head years before me was the head, Sir Michael Wilkins, who was the person who went down to Outward Grange and created Outward Grange Academies Trust. And so this old head teacher in County Durham, he was the connection between me and seeing there was a job in Outward Grange, and this is back now 2008, 2009. There are a few multi-academy trusts that were created in the country, which were city technology colleges, but the first school-based sponsored schools in the country where a number of schools were invited and only a couple took it up, and Outward Grange was one of them. And it was an outstanding school, and it converted on the 1st of September 2009 from Outward Grange College of Technology to Outward Grange Academy, because it had to take on North Doncaster Technology School, and it turned it into Outward Academy Adwick. And I came down to try and be the head teacher at Outward Academy Adwick. I applied for that job, and I didn't get it. But they gave me the job of going to Outward Grange instead. So I became the head of Outward Grange. And there's an interesting story there. I've been very fortunate. I've gotten every single job I've ever applied for in my life, except one. When I was that assistant head role I was telling you about, I applied for that and I didn't get it. And I knew I wouldn't get it. It was an internal role. I'd only been the assistant head for a couple of years. I was only in my 5th or 6th year of teaching. I was far too young. And quite rightly, it was given to this brilliant person from external. And she was so good. It's the only time I've been beaten by anyone in any job. I decided to marry her.
Oh,
so
that's a brilliant story.
So as I've said, I surrendered to my wife in life, work, and everything. And there we are.
Does she always remind you of that? I beat you to that
Well,
job.
if I ever say I've got in every job I ever applied for, she said, except
apart
the
from the one I got.
Yeah, apart from the one I beat you
Don't
in.
you forget it.
Yeah, exactly.
And through leading those schools and your time as a teacher and time as a head, was there any times when Ofsted came in that you felt misunderstood or disheartened by an inspection? And how does that inform your empathy now in the job you're doing?
Well, I started teaching then in 1995, and Ofsted in its modern guise, we've been in existence since the 1800s, but in our modern guise, we were created in 1992. So I'm started in 1995. So I've seen every single framework that's Ofsted's ever had, from a teacher, as a head of year, head of subject, assistant deputy head, chief exec of a trust. I've seen all of them. And if I try and count them, it's nearly 100 inspections that I've had in my career. There are many other chief execs now who've had way more than that, but it's still an awful lot. And I have to say, I genuinely, I mean, yes, there's a moment of you're being inspected and you're just like, come on, this is, you're on your mettle. But almost all of them have been really excellent. They might not have felt like it always at the time, but they've been excellent experiences. But there've been a couple where it was that sense of an inspector, not through any fault of their own, is communicating to you as a leader, and they say something and you think, well, what do they mean by that? And you start to read into their language. You're listening really carefully. Then you start worrying, is that something that's going to be, that they're going to focus on? And, perhaps if it's happened on day one and you think at the end of day one, right, come on, everyone, they said this, right, what have they said to you? And then you start to really overanalyze and panic about preparing for day two. And perhaps for that inspector, it was a big thing, and perhaps it was just a comment that they'd made, and actually it's not a big thing at all. And I definitely thought to myself, the best inspectors I've seen, they say this on inspection, they say, this is what you're saying to me, this is what I'm hearing, this is what I'm seeing. And they tell you what they're thinking throughout the whole inspection. So I was very clear with this methodology for this framework that we should have that mentality. And this interview's happening on the first week that the framework is out. And the feedback I'm getting already is that's what's happening on the ground. So my inspectors are saying, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm hearing, and they're telling people, we presume you're on the expected grade, and we're saying, we can see you're working at this standard, let's start looking at strong, or we can't find all the evidence that we need for this standard, can you show me where I should be looking? And that communication, that's a big part of making it feel different, feel more human. It removes that unknown quantity, and it puts quite rightly, the leader back more in control of the inspection. So that has absolutely been shaped, along with many other things that no doubt we might touch upon.
And Ofsted spent the last year listening to the sector and how they wanted this reform to happen. I mean, the need for reform was widely recognised, but what were some of the things that you heard about the way it should feel and look?
So that was the first part about no surprises. Having a big reveal at the end of day two, ta-da, these are the grades we're going, well, that's a nonsense. We shouldn't be in that scenario. I mean, of course, there might be difficult inspections where it's hard for the inspectors to gather evidence, and it might take them towards the end of day two to start to really get the full picture. But wherever possible, it should be, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're finding, and it should be an exploration together with the leaders of the setting, not just reveal at the end of day two. So that's the first part. The other part is we need greater depth in inspection. The deep dive, it's a bit of a regret I've got that people think that the deep dives, because I've said no more deep dives, and that by that, some people have over-interpreted it into saying that's no more in-depth instruction into curriculum, for example. Well, that's a nonsense. It's called the Renewed Education Inspection Framework, the Renewed EIF, because it builds upon all the practice of the old EIF. So the curriculum intent, the curriculum implementation, and the curriculum impact is still all there. It's just that there are different ways of doing it. Rather than just looking at books across a couple of year groups, you can get the same information. You can still do that, but we're just calling them focused dives now. You could do it by having conversations with middle leaders and teachers and be in the classroom and looking at books. You can do it by following particular groups of children. And that bit really interests me. So following, for example, children who've got special educational needs, or there might be looked after children in the school. Let's see what the diet is like. Let's do a deep dive via looking what it's like from the lens of these looked after children. So there's lots there, but inclusion is really important. We're doing very well as a country, educationally. We're a high-performing country unless you're disadvantaged, unless you've got special educational needs or an educational healthcare plan. So I very much use the phrase disadvantaged and vulnerable. And I used the word vulnerable on purpose because I wanted to challenge people to think, if I say disadvantaged, people think pupil premium, free school meals, they'll think special educational needs. But what about a young carer? What about a child who's looked after? What about a child whose parents might be in custody? What about a child who might be moving house? And that's where that state, not trait element of the report comes in that we did from the National Children's Bureau research and best practice who looked into this for me. So I wanted to say it's all about how well do leaders know individual children. And I think as a country, we should measure our success on the ability for all children to thrive, particularly the most vulnerable.
And I think a part of that is the phrase achieve, belong, thrive
Yeah.
has become synonymous with your leadership. Why is belonging so important to you? I mean, you spoke about it there, but is it experiences you had obviously at school, as a teacher, as a head? Why was that such a big part of this framework?
Well, the actual phrase "belong, achieve, and thrive," I give credit to my national director, Lee Elston. He was I was a secondary head, he was a primary head, and together, looking at the rigor we wanted in the framework, he very much was talking to this idea about my focus on inclusion. If a child can belong, if they feel as if their school is their school, it's a place of safety that they can go to. If you can belong, you get a chance to thrive. And they're the ingredients to achieve. And it's really very simple. Again, it comes down to how well do leaders, teachers know every individual child? How are they helping them to belong to their community? How are they helping them to thrive, which is the ingredients to achieve? Because it's really difficult to achieve if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel welcome. These are the conditions in which children flourish. And so you're absolutely right. That's the bedrock behind every element of the toolkit, along with inclusion.
And you touched on vulnerability being a state, not a trait. When you're looking at that in a school, what are you looking for when a school spots that and supports that? What are the elements you'll be looking for?
Okay, well, the state not trait was very much focused on we're not labeling children. This is not something that's, they might not be in control of the disadvantage or the nature of their vulnerability or disadvantage that exists. It's a state that they might be in, and that might be a transigent state. For some children, it might be their entire lives. They might be disadvantaged or vulnerable. There might be a disabled child, for example, a physical or a mental state. The idea is to say to leaders, it doesn't matter. That's why I used very deliberately, if a child's parent perhaps is in custody, or if they move house, or they have a bereavement, of course it's going to affect them and it'll affect their lives. It's a state that they're in at the moment, but it's not a trait which will cover across the rest of their life. It's a transigent moment. And that's why I want people to think very carefully about what's it like to be a child. And again, I use the phrase looked after children. I think a really, really good measure for ourselves as a country is to think to ourselves, if we're the corporate parent, if the government, society is literally the parent of this child, they're looked after by the state, then our success as a country should be on how well those children survive and thrive. How do they belong, achieve, and thrive? Because we're the parents. I'm the parent of them. So that's our measure for me. I generally think that. That's not to say at all that people shouldn't overinterpret that and think that children who are non-disadvantaged with high prior attainment, they absolutely are also key to the radar. But I've never, ever, ever worked in and never seen anywhere any organisation that gets it right for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged and gets it wrong for the non-disadvantaged and the higher attainer. It just doesn't happen. If leaders are focused on individual children and removing barriers, they're doing it for everyone. But the ones who need it the most are the children who are looked after by the state or they've got special educational needs. So that's why we've got to get this right. And it is a problem. This is a real problem. We are a very high-performing country unless you're disadvantaged, unless you've got special educational needs. If you're a child who's got special educational needs, you're something like more than 4.5 times more likely to be severely absent. If you're known to children's social care, you're likely to be 4 times more severely absent. And severely absent isn't 10% absence, it's 50% absent or worse. If you're a child that's disadvantaged, you're 3 times more likely to be severely absent. So that's what matters. We should measure ourselves by the achievement of the lowest and the hardest to reach communities. And that's what I'm really, really bothered, because it's a problem right now, and it's the problem of our time.
And you've now published the findings from the pilot inspections. What did you learn from those? I mean, there's some areas that you've said need refining and changing. Was there anything that surprised you? What worked really well? What feedback were you getting? And what were those things that you were like, okay, we need to change now we've seen it in practice?
The findings came from the test visits. So when we were running the consultation, we were doing test visits. Once we published the consultation response, they became pilots. Now, the tests allowed us to change the framework to what we published. The pilots was all about training the inspectors to deliver that framework. So what we learned from the test visits pre-publication was the complexity of the framework, the demand to remove the overall effectiveness grade, which I had complete sympathy with. Well, what replaces it? Is it a narrative report? Is it a graded report? How many areas do we look at? We said that the overall effectiveness grade was far too simple. We wanted something which spoke to the nuance and complexity. Was it too complicated? That's the feedback that we were hearing. It was too hard. There's too much to do in a period of time. You start to think to yourself, well, actually, what we're hearing from this feedback, consistency matters, which is why we moved to His Majesty's inspector, HMI-led inspections, because we know, as educators, we know that you get consistency, you develop knowledge and connections in your knowledge through regularly revisiting, interleaving. So what you want on inspection for consistency, you want an inspector leading who's consistency comes through constancy, so constantly leading inspections. So the employed inspectors, HMIs, they now lead school inspections. Ofsted inspectors, the ones we contract in, they team inspections. Now, some Ofsted inspectors might have led 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 inspections a year, but some might only lead once or twice a year. Well, an HMI could be leading 25, 26, 27 inspections a year. They're far more steeped in it because they're full-time inspectors. So I learned the power of that. I learned from the complexity and the ability to get through all the areas that having an additional inspector on the team was a really powerful area. What surprised me was that the reaction was, that's just more pressure. Okay, I'm trying to manage the complexity and getting through the content, and apparently adding an additional inspector is more pressure. Right, I hadn't appreciated that, especially if you're in a small school. So we learned, for example, then that rather than sending, perhaps we might have sent 2 inspectors on one day into a small school and 1 inspector on the second day. Well, having 3 inspectors in the small school on day 1 with an additional inspector and only 1 on day 2 was a nonsense. So we learned that in a small school it might be better to have 2 on day 1 and 2 on day 2 and put the additional inspector on the second day. So we learned lots about trying to reduce the stress on our inspectors, trying to manage the workload of the providers, how to try to combine some areas, curriculum and teaching, combining them, attendance and behaviour, combining them to make it more manageable in inspection. But that complexity is still important, and the nuance, because that was the original drive. The overall effectiveness grade is too simple. We need better nuance. So I'm holding on to that in my mind about the areas that we created.
And you mentioned pressure and stress. And historically, Ofsted has caused that for school leaders. People feel anxious, worried ahead of getting the call. When they do get the call, it's been quite a stressful process for school leaders. When you've been looking at this framework, you've said in some speeches that I've listened to, you don't do extra work for Ofsted, don't prepare for Ofsted, you don't need to be doing runs. But people might argue there's more areas now, there's more evaluation areas. But what does healthy readiness look like? And what would tell you that the culture has truly shifted?
Yeah, I mean, look, I know people are going to say, well, come on, you're not going to have an Ofsted inspection and think there's no more work. That's just naive. I understand that, and that's not really what I meant by it. Look, you come on an interview, so you make sure your tie's done up correctly. You're trying, well, I probably haven't, but you try and comb your hair. So, you get ready because you're being watched. So, of course, the observer principle is going to kick in. First of all, once you're watching something, it changes. And 2, you're going to make sure you want to present yourself in the best possible way. So there's going to be a sense of tension that comes because you want to perform. Ofsted doesn't want you to perform. We want to see what's a normal day like. Now, the bit I was trying to get across, and I perhaps need to try and explain it better, so let's have a go this time. And I think about actually what the key does when it's synthesizing documentation and producing model policies and trying to explain complex statutory and non-statutory guidance, what it all means. Well, actually, it's rather sort of similar idea that I had with the framework. I don't think that chief inspectors should arrive and suddenly say, this chief inspector thinks that this is the flavour for the next 5 years. Now, I know I'm going to be accused of being guilty of that, but if you go to the research behind the EIF, the renewed EIF, it's all built upon the research from the old EIF now, because this is the first week of the framework that's kicked in that we're interviewing. It's also made entirely of the statutory and the non-statutory guidance that leaders have to do anyway. So you've got to follow the statutory guidance into attendance, whether Ofsted exists or not. You've got non-statutory guidance in behaviour, and you've got statutory guidance in suspensions and exclusions. In early years, you have the early years foundation stage that early years providers follow. All of the frameworks are built entirely on what you're supposed to be doing anyway. And I think I can say that I'm giving assurance to parents, because Ofsted reports to parents, and we also report to Parliament in our annual report every year, which comes out in December, probably the time that this podcast is going out. And I think I need to say to people, this is the statutory and the duties placed upon leaders, and Ofsted's checking that they're doing what they're paid to be doing. And that bit matters. And that really ought to, if people look at the framework, they should say, this is my job. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And Ofsted's checking that I'm doing what I'm actually paid to do, what I'm supposed to do. Now, I still know that means they're going to work hard. I still know they're going to prepare. I still know there's an element of stress. I can't remove all stress from an inspection. I just can't. But the methodology, the humane approach, a Teams call rather than a phone call, see the inspector, share a screen, ask questions, having a nominee on an inspection, somebody who can break the fourth wall between the inspectors and the inspected. All of those things are to try to make it a more human process. And the feedback in this first week of inspection is that is coming through. So that bit gives me great encouragement.
And context is a big part of this framework. Why was that so important to you? And how can you reassure leaders that they won't be penalised for lack of local support or, taking on more looked after children or children with SEND?
You've just hit the nail on the head. So it's a ridiculous scenario if people are turning children away that need their help and their provision, and they use Ofsted as the excuse for turning them away because they're trying to drive up their results for Ofsted or a league table. We want the best leaders to take the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children. So you've got to bring context into account. This is the bit that's really hard, though. When you go and work in communities left behind, disadvantaged, socially, economically challenged, however you want to describe them, you don't want to create to use the well-used phrase now from American politics, the soft bigotry of low expectation. You need to make sure that those children are getting the highest possible standards. But we can't be naive. I can remember running schools where I live in North Yorkshire that were national average for free school meals. And I remember 20 miles north from that school, there is a school where it's got some of the cheapest housing in the whole of England in a much more difficult context than this area of North Yorkshire. And you're talking 60, 70% free school meal. Now, that school that's in North Yorkshire, it's very likely to achieve national averages in every single possible measure and go beyond them with real hard work and real effort, but it will likely expectedly achieve that. The school further north, it will work exceptionally hard and it might struggle to get to those averages. How do we make sure that we're trying our level best for those children in that school to the north and not lowering our expectation, but equally not saying to those leaders the context that you're working in is different? And that's the real art of inspection. That's why it's not a data-driven exercise. It's why it needs a human being to turn up. It's understanding, do the leaders know their children? Are they actually removing all the barriers? Are they doing all that they reasonably should be expected to do to help those children to belong, thrive, and achieve? And if they are, despite their data, they can still perform well from Ofsted, because we want people to be risk aware, not risk averse in taking on the most vulnerable children. And that's the art of inspection. And if people say we're inconsistent and it's because we're trying to achieve that, then I will accept that criticism, because that's the bit that matters.
And governance has a larger role in this framework. What would you be saying to governors are the sort of things that they should be asking their leaders and the sort of questions they should be bringing up to make sure they're supporting them for this framework?
Well, look, first of all, some brilliant governing bodies that I've worked with. The best governing bodies I've found in my time see Ofsted as an independent check for themselves on, leaders are telling us this, and Ofsted's independently coming in every 4 years and confirming or not that position from the leaders. So use it that way as an audit. We are, in some ways, an inspection is an audit. We're an external auditor, if you like, in that manner. So use it to help. But also, there's a reason why there is one framework, the renewed EIF, but then there are toolkits. There's a toolkit for the early years inspection, a toolkit for the schools inspection, a toolkit for further education, and so on. And it's called a toolkit because the standards are explained in every area for all of the grades, and we want people to use it not as a tick box check exercise, but nothing hidden. So governors should be able to ask their leaders, how well are you doing against, not just the Ofsted toolkit, because every one of those lines is the statutory and non-statutory duty placed upon leaders anyway. So really, how well are you doing on the things that you've actually supposed to be doing? Keeping children safe in safeguarding, attendance and behaviour, all of those areas. So governing bodies should find it rather useful for self-evaluation and self-assessment to help them get over. But this is not a return to the old SEF of self-evaluation forms. We're not interested in ring-binding folders of evidence. We're interested in a conversation. At the end of the day, as the Chief Inspector, what I really, really, really want to know is, do governors and leaders know their school? Do they know their strengths? Do they know their areas for improvement? Do they know the individual children? And if they're getting that bit right, then I'm going to be a really happy Chief Inspector.
And the Independent Wellbeing Impact Report challenged Ofsted to confront its own impact on staff stress. How did you personally take that feedback, and how has it shaped some of the things that you want to do as a leader?
Yeah, it's really hard hitting, but the right thing to do to open ourselves up. So we commissioned it. I commissioned that report as a part of the process, because I wanted to understand what our inspectors were finding, what the leaders are finding. At the end of the day, my used to, when I was running schools, it was always children first in primary, students first in secondaries. But the work to put children first gets done by staff. And we need great teachers in schools. And again, as naive as this sounds, I don't want Ofsted to be the barrier for people in the profession. And we've heard far too many times about people saying the stress of an Ofsted inspection, and that's the reason that they left. Well, leaning into it's really important, leaning into the inspection. Equally, there's an awful lot of teachers out there who use the inspection process to help them find a new job and to look for schools to work. And again, that's good and bad, because I chose to go and work in schools that were in special measures. Some people would choose to avoid a school that's in special measures, which makes recruitment even harder. So we've got to get the balance right. We are professionals. This bit, I think, is really important. And the Confederation of School Trusts, their deputy, Steve Rollett, wrote a wonderful blog on the back of a conversation I had with them on another webinar when like 900 people joined. And I got on my soapbox and ranted off for a little bit. And he wrote this brilliant blog. He always says things better than me, does Steve. And he wrote in this blog, he called it collective agency. We've got a chance now with 5 new words to describe, rather than outstanding, good, requires improvement, and inadequate. We have exceptional, strong, expected, needs attention, and urgent improvement. It's up to us now as professionals, and it's up to me as the Chief Inspector to get this across. You cannot compare the new grades to the old ones. And it's not obviously fine not to be working at the expected standard, but it's professional to say, look, I am working on this. It's not where I want it to be. I do need help. I do need to put attention to this area. It needs attention. And that bit matters. And whilst it's not fine to be working below the expected standard, it is professional to say, look, this is the journey we're on. And schools go on journeys. They're on peaks and sometimes they're on troughs. And on that journey, there'll be moments when you're working on things. There'll be moments when things might be exceptional. There'll be moments when they're strong. There'll be moments when they're expected. There'll be moments you go, it's not good enough and I'm focusing on it now. It's how we together, collectively, talk about those schools. It's how local newspapers report on those schools. It's how the community report on those schools. Way better, because what's the alternative? That somebody's dishonestly saying that this is fine when it's not. And actually, if you look at some of the successes we've had, and even though I worked in the multi-academy, so I am agnostic about who improves them. I don't care as long as somebody improves them. But getting help to a school that's struggling, getting help to those children who are struggling is the right thing to do. And whether that's intervention for a school that's in special measures, whether it's targeted support for a school that requires significant improvement, or whether it's universal support from the RISE teams to the schools that might need attention. What is it? It's help. Mm-hmm. How can help be a bad thing?
And you've talked about Ofsted. You want to change it from an organisation that rates to one that raises performance. What's been the hardest thing about changing that culture inside the organisation itself? And what's something you've said to inspectors to stop doing and something you've asked them to start doing differently?
Well, again, I was just overwhelmed by the sheer number of brilliant people that are in Ofsted. There are some fantastic colleagues, amazing people. But we work across, because we're national, we're England's inspectorate, and we even inspect other inspectorates across international inspectorates. We do work all over the parts of the world. In England, we have 8 regions. So we have North Yorkshire, North East Yorkshire and Humber, the North West, the East of England, the East Midlands, there's London, the South East, the South West, and the West Midlands, the 8 regions. Policy was being delivered nationally, created nationally by, in this case, Lee Alston, the National Director for Education, or Yvette Stanley, who's the National Director for Children's Social Care, the 2 wings of Ofsted. But it was being delivered regionally with fidelity and truth and honesty. But because you take one thing from the centre and you do it 8 different times, there's bound to be some variation in those 8 areas. And I wanted us, we are one Ofsted, we are one national body. Now, if you think of some of the biggest multi-academy trusts, they might have, 5, 6, 7 on perhaps even one of them, like, for example, United Learning. I don't know if it's got a school in every one of the 8 regions, but it won't be far off. It wants to know that if it's being inspected in the North East Yorkshire and Humber or in the South West, there is a level of consistency to the work. So that's why the first thing I did was to create the Ofsted Academy. So it takes the training nationally and it delivers it through the regions, but from a national consistent level. And having HMIs lead inspections means that just a month ago in Birmingham, I had every single HMI who leads a school inspection was in the same room, face-to-face, being trained all together at once. Now, that doesn't sound a lot, but that's really not happened much in Ofsted's 33-year history, which is incredible. The level of consistency and power you can get from that is massive. Another massive change that I made right back when I first arrived, and this was based upon the head teacher who eventually took over Outward Grange from me. He lived in, Outward Grange is in Wakefield. He lived in Sheffield. And he used to drive up the M1 every day to Wakefield. And I discovered after a while, because it was in the window for an inspection, Outward Grange, and he said, he told me that he put his suit in the car on a Monday and he didn't take it out of the car until Wednesday because he could get the call. So if he got the call on a Monday, he wouldn't go home all the way to Sheffield. He would suddenly book himself into a hotel and stay the night so he could be there early on a Tuesday morning. And I thought, so he's doing this for months and months. In fact, it's probably even in more than a year he ended up doing it. And so I jokingly said that I called this policy after him. His name was Andrew Downing. So I called it the Andy Downing policy if he's listening to this. And so I thought, well, actually, this makes sense. Can I not notify everyone on a Monday for an inspection? And there was a massive benefit to that, not just, by Monday afternoon. I mean, emergency inspections, monitoring inspections, they can happen at any time because we're Well, you don't know we're coming because you shouldn't. It's an urgent emergency inspection, or it's monitoring and you know you're in the window anyway. But routine inspections, Monday notification, Tuesday, Wednesday inspect, which means that the inspector's writing the report upon a Thursday, and here comes the benefit. On a Friday, they can now do all the other jobs that they do in Ofsted, but they can also train. And they can go through consistency meetings, which means this is being recorded on a Friday afternoon. Later today, I will be there at the national consistency meeting. There'll be local ones, regional ones. I go to the national consistency meeting where all of the inspections this week will be discussed. And even though we do hundreds, they're all coming and they're all flowing through that. And again, that matters because training was happening only a few times. Now it's happening every week. Well, and as a school leader training staff, again, interleaving, regularly visiting, regularly checking. It means your knowledge is building all the time and you're building on your practice. So I'm running Ofsted the way I ran schools. I'm taking all of that knowledge and I'm applying it to the way we work now.
And you mentioned Ofsted's annual report earlier, and that will be published this week. Could you speak us through some of the things that you've got in that report?
Yeah. And I think this is the challenge of our time, and it's right now. We can't wait any longer. I call it's a compounding avalanche of disadvantage. A child is born, and if they go into early years or not, and we've done a piece of work called Childcare Oases and Deserts, and that's an oversimplification, but we know where there are some great educational outcomes, there are childcare oases. We know that where there are often left behind areas where education is poorer on average, they are childcare deserts. So it's really important that we have more early years provision and allow parents to get back to work. But it's equally important that we have early years in the right place, because Ofsted and the Secretary of State quite rightly call early years the best start in life. So that's important. We also know that children are absent, and I've explained, for example, if you've got SEND, known to children's social care, or you're disadvantaged, the levels of severe absence that happen. We know that alternative provision is happening. Here's a shocking statistic. Children missing in education has risen by 19% in the last year alone. So let's just do that one again. Children missing in education has risen by a fifth in the last year alone. The numbers in elective home education are going up. We've hit 4,000 children's homes looked after children for the first time. 4,000. We've registered 500 more children's homes in the last year as we've hit over this 4,000 mark. On top of that 4,000 mark, we've done at least something like 658 investigations into unregistered illegal children's homes. And I could go on. I mean, I really could go on. And I set it out in the annual report. And what's happening is a child is born and they're falling behind and they're falling into disadvantage, whether it's through poverty, special educational needs, disadvantage, but whatever it is, for all the reasons I've listed, vulnerable and disadvantaged. But too often it's compounding, going to school, going to alternative provision, going into custody. Only 18% of prison education is rated as good. Only 18%. It's abominable. It's atrocious. So we've got examples of a child in a youth offending institution who's only let out of their cell for half an hour every day. There are awful examples for our most disadvantaged and vulnerable, and it compounds, it gets worse, and it's costing the country a fortune in education, in life chances for these individual children, and financially. Children in children's social care has risen from something like I forget the exact number, something like 3.6 billion in 2016 to 8.1 billion in 2024. Even allowing for inflation, it's at least £3 billion more now it's costing the country. And then we say, local authorities, why haven't you got earlier intervention? Why haven't you got speech and language therapists? Why haven't we got, well, we're spending £3 billion more on those children who are looked after. We've got to get on top of this. And so I'm really delighted that the government are really focused on these issues. And we've got a new Minister for Children's Social Care in Josh McAllister, who's talked about family help, early intervention. stopping that compounding problem, like compounding interest. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it becomes a debt you can't handle. That's what's happening to disadvantaged children in this country. We've got to intervene earlier in early years. We've got to intervene earlier in family help, kinship care, early support. We've got to go further and further and further back to stop this gap happening, because this is the problem of our time and it's right now, and we've all got to focus on it.
And I mean, you say all of those stats, and it is really stark hearing that. And you've got a big part to play as Ofsted in this. And this is a really high pressure job. It's a lot of public scrutiny. What do you do to try and switch off? And when things get too intense, what are your ways of coping with all of this pressure?
Well, I've got my wonderful wife, who reminds me that she beat me at the job.
Yeah.
No, she doesn't. It's pressure because it's important and it matters. It's a 5-year post that you get the luxury of being the chief inspector, and it's a privilege to be the chief inspector. I did wake up on Monday this week. Again, this is being recorded in the week that the framework it has been launched. I did wake up and think to myself, that's 12.6 million 0 to 16-year-olds, something like 15 million 0 to 18-year-olds, and a much bigger number if you take children to high needs to the age of 25 and adults in apprenticeships, a much bigger number still. I did wake up with a bit of a gulp and thought, oh, good grief, that's my framework now.
That's quite a Monday morning.
It was quite a Monday morning. But then you get back into the job, and people have a view on Ofsted, whether it's critical or supportive, because it matters. Whether you agree with Ofsted or not, education matters. Children's social care matters. Most of, apart from the children missing in education, people go to school. Everyone has a view. And it's because it's important. So, look, it is hard, but it's a privilege. And so I'm determined to make the best that I possibly can. Will I get it right? No, but I'll give it my best shot every single day.
And when you look back in possibly 10 years' time, I'm sure that feels like a lifetime away, considering how much has happened in the last 2 years. But what do you hope the emotional legacy of your time as His Majesty's Chief Inspector will be for the teachers, the leaders, the staff, and the pupils in those schools during your tenancy?
Well, we're about raising standards and improving lives for everyone, particularly the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. So that's at the heart of what I want to do. I want it to feel like a more humane, a fairer, a more consistent process. For all children, it is my North Star. It has to be all children, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged, because it is a disgrace if we don't do better for them. And it has to be better for them. And we've tried and we've tried and we've tried, but we're not getting much better. In fact, it's in many cases, children missing education, it's getting worse. Well, that's just not good enough. And so I'm determined, and I'm absolutely certain that the Secretary of State is equally determined that we are going to sort this, and we have got to put all of our effort and all of our attention. And I know that the leaders out there, that's what they want to do every single day. And Ofsted must help. It must help. It mustn't hinder. We've got to get this right, and we have got to call out when it's not good enough for them. It's our legal duty to say when things are not good enough for children. It's also our moral duty to find out what's best for children. And that's why we've got the exceptional grade in our framework too. You can't compare it to the old outstanding. It's exceptional. It's different. Every grade is different. So it's about finding the very, very best practice and saying, look, in this community, this is working. And others, should they say, let's go visit. Let's go find out what they're doing that's so special. Let's be professional about it and help each other.
And we like to finish the podcast with a quick fire 4 questions.
Okay.
So question number 1, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing the education sector right now?
Closing the gap for disadvantaged and vulnerable, which financially causes difficulty in the finances that are there. But how do we get on top of the finances? By going earlier and fixing that problem. That's that £3 billion that I talked about, for example, in children's social care. So the financial challenge is the disadvantage challenge. It's all compounding. It's the same problem. Not a quick answer, but I just want to keep hammering that. It's a compounding problem, and that's why it matters.
Second question, what motivates you on difficult days?
Children first.
Third question, what has been your proudest achievement in your career so far?
Well, becoming His Majesty's Chief Inspector was a fairly big moment. Actually, my proudest moments are individual minutes with children and having conversations with them. And even once I got the job and I got a national profile, I've had children that I taught 22 years ago. I had sorry, this isn't a short of answer.
No.
There's somebody who runs the Early Years Alliance. He's a most marvellous man, Neil Leach. I just find him I meet lots of inspirational people. Neil Leach is an inspirational man. And I met him in the childcare exposition in Coventry. And he brought someone along whose name's Lenny Tyler, who works with him. And he said, "Oh, you'll not remember Lenny, but you used to teach him." I said, "Yeah, I taught you 26, 27 years ago." I said, "You had the same hairstyle, but it was blonder. And I remember you dropped my subject at the end of year 9, but I took you on for cricket. And I taught you cricket as you got older." And he was blown away because I could still remember him as an individual child. So my proudest moments are some of those individual connections as a teacher.
Amazing. And the final question, what are you most looking forward to the rest of this academic year?
I'm looking forward to launching this annual report, and I'm looking forward to getting really stuck into doing everything, every single thing that I can do and this office can do to help leaders out there to close this disadvantage gap. It has to happen.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, it is the week of the launch of the new framework. I can't even imagine how busy you've been. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak to us and inform leaders who are listening.
No, well, thank you. And thanks to everybody out there who's out there doing the job at the coalface. Thank you, everyone.
That brings us to the end of this special episode, and what an important conversation to be a part of. We heard themes of belonging, context, culture, and fairness. We also heard about the ambition for inspection to feel collaborative, and that trust will only be built through lived experience, not words alone. A huge thank you to Sir Martyn Oliver for joining us and for speaking with honesty about the opportunities and challenges ahead. If this episode gave you insight, reassurance, or food for thought, please do share it with colleagues. And remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss the launch of Series 3 in the new year. Until next time, thank you for listening.